What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be talking about one must-draft player in every single round of your fantasy football drafts. So I think if you guys are able to go out, draft at least a few of these guys at their current ADP, you can put together some very impressive fantasy rosters. If you have not drafted yet, you're drafting this weekend, in the next few days. I've posted my top 200 fantasy football rankings. They're free for you guys. You can download the sheet. The link is going to be in the description. So if you want to use those in your draft, feel free to do so. And if you guys enjoy the video, do me a huge favor, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. But let's dive right into round one. And I'm getting my consensus ADP from 4for4. They basically just combine a bunch of different fantasy platforms to get their consensus ADP. And in round one, I think the ADP is fairly sharp. I don't know if there are any insane values, but there are two guys, Bijan Robinson and Garrett Wilson, who I have a spot or two ahead of where consensus ADP is at. So first off with Bijan Robinson, I have him as my 105, my fifth overall player behind Breece Hall, and he's going at the 106. So I think he's a slight value, especially on more running back hungry platforms where maybe you won't like the guys that get to you in round two, round three. You want to get that RB1 up there. I think Bijan Robinson, a very solid target. And then I also like Garrett Wilson. He's going at the 111. I'd be willing to pick Garrett Wilson as early as the 109. Also like the 110. I feel like him and A.J. Brown are pretty close together in my rankings. So it is a pretty competitive tier with those wide receivers. A.J. Brown, Garrett Wilson, Puka Nacua. But I do think if I'm drafting him at the 111, I'm feeling pretty good about it. Now shifting into round two, probably my favorite pick in all of fantasy is going to be a late second round Devon Achane. I feel like getting him at that 2-3 turn area is a complete steal, especially on more running back hungry platforms. Like on ESPN, I think he's like a round 3, round 4 pick, which is wild. I think Yahoo, he's somewhere in round 3, 2-3 turn. So on these platforms where other running backs are getting pushed up, for some reason Devon Achane is viewed as like a cheaper option than when you're drafting on more competitive platforms. And I know there are some concerns with him. He's kind of small. People think he's injury prone. You have Raheem Mostert. But Achane came in as a rookie and delivered one of the most efficient running back seasons of all time. He's going to be on probably the best rushing offense in the NFL. He's a perfect fit in this Mike McDaniel offense. He can also catch passes. And now heading into year two, he has the ability to expand on his workload. And I get it. Maybe these are minor concerns. He's not the biggest running back. He's in a split with the 32-year-old Mostert. But I feel like people are forgetting he was in the same split last year where Mostert scored 21 touchdowns and Achane still averaged over 20 PPR points per game in his healthy matchups. So at pick 23, I will draft Achane there 100% of the time. Love him as that 2-3 turn option. In round three, I really like Nico Collins. He's my wide receiver 11 this year, and he is my 19th overall player. I understand there's pretty legit competition with Stephon Diggs, with Tank Dell, but everything is pointing towards Nico Collins being the clear Texans wide receiver 1. He was the wide receiver 7 in points per game last year. He has the built-in chemistry with CJ Stroud. He's been in on 2 wide receiver sets this preseason, and I think he's the guy that's not going to lose out. If Tank Dell really starts to play well, I feel like, those snaps, those routes are going to come out of, Stephon Diggs compared to Nico Collins. I feel like he's in there 2 wide receiver sets, locked and loaded for the entire season. And I just think there's going to be enough volume to go around. Stroud has the second highest odds to lead the NFL in passing yards. He has the third highest odds to lead the NFL in passing touchdowns. So this is going to be a top tier offense. It's going to be a top tier passing attack. And we have multiple examples of offenses within the last 20 years successfully supporting 3 wide receivers. So you can see 5 different teams here. We have the 2021 Tampa Bay Buccaneers, where you had Chris Godwin and AB up at 17.3 points per game. Mike Evans was at 16.4. You had the 2018 Rams, where 3 guys averaged between 15 and 17 points per game. We had the 2013 Broncos, where Demaryius Thomas almost broke 20 points per game. Eric Decker up at 17.5. Welker above 16. The 2012 Packers, where you had Jordy Nelson, Randall Cobb between 14 and 16 points per game. I want to say Greg Jennings that year also was somewhat relevant for fantasy. And then the 2004 Colts, you had Marvin Harrison Jr. up at almost 18 points per game, Reggie Wayne almost at 17, and then Stokely at 14.6. So here are a bunch of different examples. When you have a top passing attack, you can support 3 weapons for fantasy, and most recently, we saw that in 2021. Now, some of these circumstances, you definitely get lucky with certain injuries where, guys can play more, where like all three of them aren't on the field the entire time. But I'm still very confident in Nico Collins here, even in a congested wide receiver room. Now, shifting into round 4, my favorite target is going to be Malik Neighbors, and I felt like he was gaining a lot of steam, even in more casual platforms. He was getting a ton of great reports out of training camp, but I feel like the Daniel Jones preseason performance kind of scared some people off. At least that's kind of what I'm hoping for as someone who wants to draft a lot of Malik Neighbors. And this is just a bet on the elite talent of a guy like Malik Neighbors. He was the 6th overall pick. He had great college production. He's a very talented athlete. And I know people are scared off from guys like Garrett Wilson, Drake London having rougher seasons in not so great situations, especially younger guys, into their rookie years. But I feel like the main difference here is that I have trust in Brian Daboll. This is not a Nathaniel Hackett with Garrett Wilson. This is not an Arthur Smith with Drake London. Malik Neighbors is by far the best wide receiver that Daboll's had to work with here in his time with the Giants. I think the volume's going to be there, and I just think Malik Neighbors is too good to not produce if he's getting a solid amount of volume. I feel like a rookie season Jalen Waddle type year could definitely be in the range of outcomes where maybe he's not as insanely efficient as what we saw in college or, later on in his career once he got good quarterback play. But the volume's going to be there, and I do think that can carry him to like a fringe wide receiver one season. So getting the talent of Neighbors in round 4, in my opinion, is a must draft. Now, pivoting into round 5, another younger wide receiver, it is going to be Tank Dell. And I'm sure people have the same concerns with Tank as they did with Nico Collins, maybe even to a larger degree. But just like I'm doing with Nico Collins, I want talented pieces of this Texans offense, and Tank Dell is certainly that. We saw last year in games where Nico Collins and Tank Dell both played together and over 50% of the snaps, both of them averaged over 18 PPR points per game, and Tank Dell actually outscored Nico Collins in those matchups. It was very close. I'm not making the argument that Tank Dell should be drafted ahead of Nico Collins, but I think they were both, clearly producing when they were out on the field together. The main concern here for Tank Dell is obviously that he is not currently playing in 2 wide receiver sets. That is going to Nico Collins and Stephon Diggs, but I definitely think he's good enough, has the upside to work his way in, either, splitting those opportunities with Stephon Diggs or just completely overtaking him, in those 2 wide receiver sets. But I think you're kind of getting that baked in at this price. Like if he was guaranteed 2 wide receiver sets, I would have him ranked so recklessly high. Like I feel like I'm already high on him now. I would have him probably fringe wide receiver 1 if he was already locked into those 2 wide receiver sets. So I really like Tank Dell. I think he has the opportunity to improve on his workload. And we can just throw up that graphic again that I showed earlier. You can see even in these crowded wide receiver rooms, if you're looking at the guys that are the third options, like Mike Evans, 16.4 points per game, Cooks, 15.2, Welker, 16.1, Nelson, 14, Stokely, 14.6. Like with where you're drafting them, these types of seasons as the wide receiver 3, that's not even saying like he could overtake Stephon Diggs. Just as the wide receiver 3, he could still pay off even if he's not really eating into Diggs usage. So I really like Tank in the 5th round. Round 6, we're just going to keep rolling with the wide receivers. It is going to be Rashee Rice. And I feel like the last few weeks have just been great for Rashee Rice all across the board. First, you have the Hollywood Brown injury, which I feel like Rashee Rice already had, the inside track to getting a starting spot within this wide receiver room. But I feel like it really just cemented the fact that Rashee Rice will be a top 2 wide receiver on this team. And then it also seems like he's going to avoid a suspension. And I mean, it seems like it's trending towards him just not getting one for this 2024 season. That was definitely something that was limiting his ADP, throughout the offseason. We assumed he was getting hit with something. It might happen next year, but at this point, it doesn't seem like it's happening here in 2024. And we really saw Rashee Rice start to break out towards the end of last year. In his last 5 regular season games, he averaged 18.5 PPR points per game. I think there are some reasonable concerns about the way he was used. He was a very low ADOT guy last year, 4.8 average depth of target, which is very low. It's a lot of manufactured touches, just kind of getting the ball in his hands, not as earned as targets that are, deeper down the field. So are those opportunities still going to be there when you have guys like Xavier Worthy, Hollywood Brown that can stretch the field? I think Xavier Worthy is also someone who could, succeed with some of those dump off targets, just getting the ball in his hands, letting him make plays. But I think at this point, he broke out as a rookie. If someone performs well as a rookie, you typically want to buy into it. So he could end up just straight up being the wide receiver 1 for a bounce back Chiefs offense, which in round 6 is an absolutely insane price to get someone with that type of upside. More wide receivers here in round 7. I want to talk about Chris Godwin, and I feel like he is a prime bounce back candidate here in 2024. Chris Godwin was a top 15 wide receiver in points per game from 2019 through 2022. He fell all the way down to wide receiver 34 last year, which was very rough compared to Mike Evans at wide receiver 10. And I don't really think it's crazy that Chris Godwin dipped from his top 15 production because, those 4 years you were getting Jameis Winston, who wasn't giving you great quarterback play, but in terms of giving you volume for fantasy, the pass attempts, the yardage, the touchdowns, all of that, it was still very impressive. And then from 2020 through 2022, he had Tom Brady. So going from Brady and then Winston throwing the ball a million times a game for 5,000 plus yards to now Baker Mayfield, it definitely was a drop off. So I wasn't shocked to see Chris Godwin's production go down, but I think it was just the extreme difference between Mike Evans at wide receiver 10 and then Chris Godwin at wide receiver 34. And the one big change that I think we have to point out here is that from 2019 through 2022, Chris Godwin played at least 50% of his snaps from the slot. In those 4 seasons, Godwin actually outscored Mike Evans in 3 of the 4, but they were always very, very close together. This isn't like a Chris Godwin over Mike Evans argument. It's just trying to show that in those 4 years, they were always neck and neck in terms of points per game, very, very in line. Last year, when we saw the extreme difference, Chris Godwin's slot percentage fell to 24%. So he went from playing at least half his snaps in the slot to now under a quarter of them when he was under Dave Canales. But Dave Canales is now gone. He is the head coach of the Panthers. Chris Godwin is going to move back into the slot. And I expect Mike Evans and Chris Godwin's production to kind of even up here. It's why I'm a little bit lower on Mike Evans in consensus, and then probably a little bit higher on a guy like Chris Godwin. Now, pivoting into round 8, we probably have a top 3 value, in my opinion. It is going to be Xavier Worthy, and I have Worthy ranked all the way up as my wide receiver 28. So high-end wide receiver 3, I feel like that's going to be higher than pretty much anyone out there. And I really think everything is pointing to him having a monster rookie season. I feel like the Hollywood Brown injury, just like it helped Rashee Rice, I think it helped Xavier Worthy even more, kind of locked him into a starting wide receiver spot, at least through the preseason, potentially early on in the regular season also. And if he can secure that role, there's definitely an opportunity where he just locks it down and never looks back. I think it's also notable that he's already getting those starting wide receiver looks because it took Rashee Rice until week 13 last year to see back-to-back games with a 60+% route participation. And you have to think about how poor that wide receiver room was. Kadarius Toney was the wide receiver 1 early on. You had Justin Watson, Sky Moore. There was just a whole lot of nothing at wide receiver for the Chiefs last year. And Rashee Rice, still they really slowed his role in terms of getting him involved as a full-time starter. They've already given Xavier Worthy that opportunity, playing with the ones in the preseason. He's a first-round pick. I think his skill set matches really well with Patrick Mahomes. I do think they want to push the ball down the field way more than they did last year. So I feel like round 8 is just an insane price to pay for Xavier Worthy, and I would literally draft him there every single time. I'd be willing to take him in the 5th round. For one draft, 4 or 5 turn, that's where I'd be willing to go with Xavier Worthy. So getting him a few rounds after that is an amazing pick. In round 9, we have another rookie wide receiver. It is going to be Keon Coleman, and just another rookie that is in a really, really good situation this year. The number 1 target role for Josh Allen is wide open. Stephon Diggs is gone. Gabe Davis is gone. You have Dalton Kincaid looking for a year 2 breakout. Brought in Curtis Samuel. Khalil Shakir is looking to step up here. But Keon Coleman has had an 100% route participation with the starters in both of the preseason games. So it seems like he has already locked down a pretty clear starting role. He's definitely not the perfect prospect, and he still needs to be talented enough to perform. Situation can't completely carry you. Quentin Johnson last year, had the opportunity to get starting reps with Justin Herbert. He didn't pan out because he just straight up wasn't good enough. But the upside is very, very real. And in the 9th round, there's not a ton of risk compared to the upside of potentially drafting the wide receiver 1 for Josh Allen. So Keon Coleman, for me, smash pick in round 9. And then we're going to have another rookie wide receiver in round 10. I really like these rookies, especially on platforms like ESPN, Yahoo, where they're really getting pushed down draft boards. Even Sleeper, I feel like a lot of these guys are really solid picks. So we have round 10, Brian Thomas Jr., and I really just think getting him in double-digit rounds is wild. He's an impressive round 1 prospect. He is stepping into the Calvin Ridley role from last year, which I know really wasn't great for fantasy, but Ridley had the ninth most expected points out of all wide receivers. He just didn't necessarily convert with all the opportunities he was given. Brian Thomas Jr. has already earned his way into two wide receiver sets with Gabe Davis. I know a lot of people really like Christian Kirk, but he is the clear-cut wide receiver 3 in usage, and he was going to be the wide receiver 3 in usage last year until Zay Jones got hurt. I think it was like week 2. Brian Thomas Jr. also has a skill set that aligns really well with Trevor Lawrence. T-Law was 3rd in deep passes last year. He was top 10 in deep pass completion percentage, so he wants to push the ball down the field. Calvin Ridley was 8th in wide receiver deep targets. He was 3rd in red zone targets. Last year, Brian Thomas Jr. caught 14 of his 18 deep targets. He led all college wide receivers on yards from deep passes, and then he also led all wide receivers in touchdowns. So we know Trevor Lawrence is going to look to him in the red zone. We know he's going to look for him down the field, and I think Brian Thomas Jr. is talented enough, to kind of earn that role in both those areas. So I really like Brian Thomas Jr. here in round 10. Now we're finally getting off the wide receiver position in round 11. And my favorite pick here, I don't know if there's anyone I'm like insanely in on, but I'm totally cool taking Zach Charbonnet in the 7th round. I feel like at worst, if you're drafting Charbonnet, he's going to be like a really good handcuff running back behind Kenneth Walker. But I also feel like there are real ways for him to kind of work his way into this offense, get somewhat of a workload, and potentially become playable. Not saying it's overly likely, but I think there are some paths where he could work his way in here. With new offensive coordinator Ryan Grubb coming in, I do think you have the opportunity to kind of shake up your usage from last year. You don't have the same coaching staff that's loyal to one player. They drafted Kenneth Walker early, also drafted, Zach Charbonnet in the 2nd round, but I don't think last year's usage automatically transfers over here in 2024. But from what we've heard so far, it does seem like Kenneth Walker's had a really good camp. It seems like he's impressing, so he definitely should be the favorite to be like the clear-cut RB1 here. But Kenneth Walker has struggled in short yardage situations so far in his NFL career. Charbonnet's the bigger running back, could work in near the goal line, short yardage stuff. Charbonnet also has the much better college receiving profile. I know we've heard a lot of stuff about Kenneth Walker getting more involved in the passing game, and that could be great. It would be fun to see, but typically guys who don't catch a ton of passes in college, it doesn't necessarily change up in the NFL. There are obviously exceptions. Kenneth Walker could be that guy, but I just think there's a argument that could be made that Charbonnet could work it on the goal line, also get some receiving work, and I think it's just a solid like depth running back pick in round 11. And then the final round here, round 12, the best option pretty clearly for me is Rico Dowdle. I feel like round 12 Rico Dowdle is just a very easy kind of player in ADP to hit the draft button on. I'd bet on Rico Dowdle being the best fantasy option from this backfield. We know that Zeke is washed. He's been washed for at least a couple years now. At least Dowdle is like a little bit more of a mystery where I'm not making the argument he's like some sort of insane running back, but at least it's like unknown. We don't know if he's terrible, right? We know at this point in Zeke's career, he is not a good running back. I want pieces of this backfield. The Cowboys led the NFL in points last year, so someone is going to be playable within this offense. Maybe it's someone like Khalil Herbert or like another guy that gets cut or traded, and then obviously, we'd be SOL here with Rico Dowdle. But in terms of guys that are actually on the roster right now, Rico Dowdle would be the guy I'm betting on here. So those are my favorite targets from the top 12 rounds of your fantasy football drafts. Let me know your thoughts down below. If you enjoyed, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and then also check out my rankings in the description if you guys are interested. But thank you all for stopping by. Either later today or tomorrow, I should have my least favorite, draft picks in the same rounds. Obviously, it's probably just as important to, avoid the landmines as it is to hit on your picks. So stay tuned for that. Thank you guys again, and I will see you in the next one.